reader, and appreciate you all being all. Praise the Lord, my soul, all my inmost being. Praise his holy name.
Praise the Lord, my soul, and forget not all his benefits, who forgives all your sins and heals all your diseases.
Who redeems your life from the pit and crowns you with love and compassion. Who satisfies your desires with good things so that your youth is renewed like the eagles.
The Lord works righteousness and justice for all the oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses, his deeds to the people of Israel.
The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love.
He will not always accuse, nor will he harbor his anger forever. He does not treat us as our sins deserve, or repay us according to our iniquities.
For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his love for those who fear him.
As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us.
As the Father has compassion on his children, so the Lord has compassion on those who fear him.
For he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust.
The life of mortals is like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field.
The wind blows over it, and it is gone, and its place remembers it no more.
But from everlasting to everlasting, the Lord's love is with those who fear him, and his righteousness with their children's children.
Those who keep his covenant and remember to obey his precepts.
The Lord has established his throne in heaven, and his kingdom rules over all.
Praise the Lord, you his angels, you mighty ones who do his bidding, who obey his word.
Praise the Lord, all his heavenly hosts, you his servants who do his will.
Praise the Lord, all his works everywhere in his dominion. Praise the Lord, my soul.
Thank you for that reading together. Let us turn and look to in Christ alone, and O Master, let me walk with thee. Please stand along with us.
Today's Bible verse will be read from the book of John, chapter 13, verses 34 and 35. Sorry, my contacts should have been replaced. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Last Sunday at this time, I was snowed in with about 50 men from Johns Creek Methodist Church at a Catholic retreat center about 30 minutes north of Dahlonega. I think it worked out pretty well because I understand y'all got here right. And you had a preacher lined up. Worked out well because if I'd been at Bent Tree, I couldn't have gotten down the mountain. We had to wait until about, I think it was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when we could get down from the retreat center and hit the highway and come back over to Jasper. So I'm glad you had somebody here with you. They tell me Dave did a good job, and I enjoyed being with Johns Creek men. I'm glad Kathy was able to come with me today. That's her back there if you didn't meet her. You've heard me say, most of you have, that her mother, her 93-year-old mother, has moved up here near us, and they both go to Jasper First Methodist. I do too when I'm not working. And so that's why you're only seeing her now, because she sits there with the mother. And I'm glad that they have that proximity to each other, and they have that ability to worship together. I brought a very poorly reproduced visual aid, but I can guide you through what that is. Those are copies of an original picture that has written on the back the date 1921. In the background, on the far left side, if you look closely, you'll see there's a Model T Ford. The rest of the picture is dominated by just the corner of a log cabin. And if you begin looking at that for a while, you'll begin to realize that the focal point is a window in the corner, a single open window. Standing beneath the window is a tall, slender young man wearing a gray felt hat, a white dress shirt, dress pants, and a dark top coat. That cabin was the home of my great-grandparents, Louis Bevel and Margaret Harrington Jones. They lived on a farm in Banks County. Y'all know where Banks County is? They were between the two metropolises of Lular and Homer. They call it Lular, but it's spelled L-U-L-A. And they call it Homer, but it's H-O-M-E-R. I've never figured that out, but that's where they live. The man in the picture is my grandfather, Louis Bevel Jones, Jr. He was the 10th of 11 children born to my great-grandparents. When he was 8 years old, Bevel was standing nearby as two of his older brothers sawed logs with a cross-cut saw. Those seemed to be dangerous, and this one was. Suddenly the saw leapt out of the cut, and it gashed my grandfather's right leg, cut it to the bone. His mother raced to his side. She had enough presence of mind to stop by the fireplace on the way out, knowing that he had been cut and was bleeding, and she grabbed some soot, some ashes, and she used that to staunch the bleeding, and then she carried Bevel to his bed where he stayed for weeks. I can remember him telling of lying in his bed, which is in the corner of the cabin where that window is. And he said that at night he would look out that window, and about all he could see was a small patch of stars. His leg eventually healed, but it was stiff all of his life. He rarely wore short pants, but occasionally he did, and you could see the soot still beneath the skin of that leg. When Bevel was 10 years old, he developed a serious illness. The doctor rode out to the cabin and examined him, and then took his parents into the kitchen and said, "I've done all that I can do." He said, "Your son has rheumatic fever, and I am in despair, for I'm almost certain he will die." To which his mother replied, "Bevel will live." For more than 2 years, he was confined to his bed in the corner of that cabin. On one side of the bed was the chair where his mother sat and prayed for him daily and slept by his side many a night. On the other side of the bed was the window of the cabin, through which he could spot a small patch of stars on clear nights. At the age of 19, Bevel felt a strong call to preach, and he decided that he needed to go to college in order to have the education he needed to be a pastor. And so, with $26 in his pocket, he and his younger brother Sam drove a 2-horse wagon for 2 days over the narrow trails and roads in the North Georgia mountains that led to Hiawassee and Young Harris College. One of his teachers later said, "Bevel, you were so green when you got here, we had to keep the cows away from you." When the registrar asked how many grades Pop had completed, he said he didn't know because the one-room school he had attended wasn't divided into classes. So the registrar gave him a test, and that test indicated that Pop had the equivalent of a 5th grade education. So instead of enrolling in the college, he had to enroll in Young Harris Academy. That's the elementary school. And I remember hearing him talk years later about how embarrassing it was to be 19 years old in a class full of fifth graders. He said the toughest part was being stood down by 11-year-olds each week in the spelling bee. But he lived with the embarrassment, and he worked his way through the academy and into the college. The Reverend Dr. Joseph Sharp was the president of Young Harris College. He was also the pastor of the local Methodist church. He took a liking to Pop and nicknamed him Beveled Edge. That's what bevel means, you know. It's a cut that's on an angle. So he called my grandfather Beveled Edge and was like a father to him for the next 6 years. In the spring of 1914, when he was still a year away from graduating, he developed serious digestive problems that were related to his rheumatic fever as a child. He lost so much weight and he felt so weak that he finally went to Dr. Sharp's office and told Dr. Sharp that he had to leave school while he still had enough strength to get back over the mountains. And Dr. Sharp said, "Beveled Edge, you're not going to quit. God called you to preach, and I'm going to help God fulfill that calling." He said, "Mrs. Sharp is a good cook. You'll come take your meals 3 times a day at our table with us. And when you're well enough, you can go back to class." A month later, he returned to classes. By the time he graduated as a member of the class of 1915, he'd become recognized as a real leader, friendly, devoted, fun-loving, enthusiastic. He took a correspondence course to become a Methodist minister. During his examination, he was asked the traditional question that all candidates for Methodist ministry are asked, and one of them, "Are you in debt so as to be embarrassed by it?" And Pop said, "Sir, I've been in debt to so many for so long, it has ceased to be an embarrassment to me." He became one of the most beloved pastors in the North Georgia Conference, and he was still serving a church at age 82 when he died of a heart attack. A few years later, his son, my dad, was named a trustee of Young Harris College. And Dad asked me to come with him to the installation service. It was over. When the sermon was over, Dad said, "Buzzy, I want to find the monument that I understand Dad's class gave the college when they graduated." And he went one way and I went the other and searched for it, and he wasn't where I was. And I turned the corner and came back toward the quadrangle, and I saw my dad. And he was sitting on a bench. And he was next to what had to be the monument. And his head was in his hands. And he was trembling because he was crying so. And I walked up to that monument, and I looked at what was chiseled on it, the class of 1916. The words, "Per aspera ad astra." I'd had 5 years Latin by then, so I knew what it meant. It's a slogan that many people use now. Per aspera ad astra means through hardships to the stars. And I know what Dad was thinking. He was thinking what I was thinking. He was thinking about all the times we'd heard my grandfather talk about lying in his bed, recovering from one thing or another, looking through that window at a small patch of stars. Now, what struck me when I wrote this story down for the first time was that this story, the larger story, is a collection of small stories. The story of Margaret Harrington Jones, who sat by her son's bed for more than 2 years, nursing and praying him back to health. That's one of the smaller stories. The story of Sam Jones, a young brother who drove that 2-horse wagon across the mountains for 2 days and then by himself drove it back home. The story of Ella Sharp, cooking extra food and setting an extra place at her tables 3 times a day for a month for a boy that she'd never really known until then, and he stayed there till he regained his health. The story of Joseph Sharp, the president and the pastor taking a liking to the 19-year-old farm boy with a fifth-grade education, and then determining that he would nurture him through to graduation. Had it not been for those smaller stories, I wouldn't be who I am, and frankly, I might not exist at all. Those stories are about a word that can change a life and sometimes literally save a life. That word is love. I heard somebody say this years ago, and I wrote it down, and I've never forgotten it. She said, when all is said and done, none of us will be measured by how much we accomplished. No, we will be measured by how well we loved. When all is said and done, none of us will be measured by how much we accomplished. We will be measured by how well we loved. Now, I believe that's also how churches will be measured. I don't believe churches will be measured by the size of their membership or their budget or their buildings. I don't think churches will be judged by the beauty of the music or the power of the preaching or by the orthodoxy of their theology or the purity of the people, all of which are blessings for which we should be grateful. But a church will be measured by how much of God's love it pours back into the world. Now, that isn't always easy. Sometimes it's hard to love. Paul knew that from experience, and he wrote about it to his churches in several letters. In one of them, his letter to the Colossians, Paul says, loving another human being calls for being completely humble, which means refusing to be the final judge about who's right and who's wrong. He said, love calls for being gentle with each other. Wow, we've forgotten that one, haven't we? Love calls for being gentle with each other instead of violent or abusive. It calls for being patient instead of always rushing to be the first one to speak. Paul says love calls for bearing with one another. Now, I like one of the newer translations of that. It says love calls for putting up with each other. Now, that works for me, William, because I think that's what life is really like, even in the church sometimes. Sometimes you've got to put up with each other. Putting up with each other means you may have to tolerate someone who's just a real aggravation. I bet a name just came to mind. Don't say it, but I bet it just came to mind. Sometimes loving each other means learning to care about someone with whom you strongly disagree. I'm having lunch, Kathy and I are, with a longtime friend and his wife at, where are we going? Out back. He and I agree on very few things. We've loved each other for 30 years. Sometimes loving another person means you have to actually endure the hatred of someone who's out to get you. But a church will be measured by how much of God's love it pours back out into the world. Which brings me to say a final word about the human heart. There was a time when I never thought much about my heart. I mean, every once in a while, Kathy would say I had a good heart. And every once in a while, my kids would say, Dad, you got a good heart. And every once in a while, people in my church would say, David, you have a good heart. And every year when I'd go for my annual physical, my physician would take some of those little suction cup things, and plaster them all over my body. And then he'd send a little electric charge through it, and I'd hear that paper tape coming out of the machine. And then he'd look at it, and he'd say, David, you've got a good heart. So imagine my surprise 10 years ago when he did all that, and he pulled the tape out and he looked at it and he said, David, you need to see a cardiologist. Which I did. And eventually I had a valve replacement surgery 2 years later when it was time. And that's when I learned about what cardiologists call the ejection fraction. If you watch Mythbusters, every once in a while they'll put a sign that says, get ready for a science moment. I mean, this is a science moment, a medical moment. Let me tell you about this. I learned this. My friend Bill Ritter, I told him about what's happening. He said, well, let me help you understand what the ejection fraction is. This is the way he put it. He said, picture your heart at any given moment as being completely full of blood. Not pumping it, but just for a minute, picture your heart storing blood and attach a number to that fullness. He said, let's attach 100%. When your heart is full, that's 100%. He says, now picture your heart pumping, ejecting that blood throughout your body. Except at any given moment, your heart never pumps out or ejects all the blood that it's holding. Some of the blood stays behind. It's supposed to. How much stays behind? Well, about a third of it. So if your heart is working normally, the fraction that is ejected is around 2/3, or 65%. That's normal, for your heart to pump 65% of the blood that's in it out into your body. The other 35% stays home. Now, when you have an infection in your heart, or you have a faulty valve like I did, your heart gets bigger. Except this is one of those cases where bigger is not better. In this case, bigger is harder, stiffer, less able to pump, which means less blood gets pumped out and more blood stays home. There are people who pump out only 35% of the blood in their heart. They can work, but they better have a desk job. There are people who eject only 15% of the blood in their heart. They're alive, but it's all they can do to get from their bed to a chair. Now, my friend Bill said, David, imagine a conversation between the heart and the rest of your body. Imagine the heart saying, it's my blood, and I see absolutely no reason why I shouldn't be allowed to keep it all. He said, David, you know what would happen if the heart couldn't be persuaded otherwise, don't you? He said, death is what would happen. Other organs might die first, but a dead heart would quickly follow. Here's the point. This principle of the ejection fraction applies to every area of life. By which I mean, once you have something, you can choose to keep it and not part with any of it if you want to. But if you're not willing to part it, sooner or later something inside you will die. I mean, it might even kill you. And that's why, on the night before he was crucified, Jesus took the old commandment from the Old Testament, you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself, and he changed it. Right before he died, he changed it. He said, fellas, I have a new commandment for you. Now listen to it. Love one another not as you love yourself. I sometimes don't do a very good job of loving myself. So he says, love one another not as you love yourself. Love one another as I have loved you. A whole new ball game. The commandment to love your neighbor wasn't new. What's new is in the words, as I have loved you. Which means that Jesus is now the pattern that we're supposed to live by. As I have loved you, so you also should love one another. So, back to the title of this whole message. How do you measure a church? Jesus' answer is clear. You measure a church by how much love like his moves in and out of it. In and out of it. In and out of it. Let's pray. We praise you, Lord, and thank you that you know everything there is to know. Before we get up in the morning, before we turn on the TV or go online, you know the world's news and you know our own news. Nothing that happens escapes your eye. Lord, we pray for the day when our love for you and our love for our neighbors will reflect your love for them and your love for for us. And everybody said, amen.